A millionaire's son invites a homeless woman into his mansion, thinking it's just a kind gesture during a storm. But when she steps inside, something stirs, an overwhelming sense of familiarity she can't explain, until she notices a birthmark on his wrist that matches a memory she thought was lost forever. As tension builds, the boy's wealthy guardian watches with suspicion, fearing everything he's built could crumble. What secrets lie hidden in the past that connect them? Why did fate bring her here now? Is she really who she claims to be? Or is there something even more heartbreaking behind it all? What will happen when the truth finally comes out and threatens to tear their fragile world apart? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the busy city street as Maverick carefully arranged his treasures on a worn blue cloth. His small hands moved with purpose, positioning each item just right. A collection of shiny rocks, colorful marbles, and trinkets he'd found during his walks around the neighborhood. Though his sweater was frayed at the edges and his sneakers had seen better days, his smile remained as bright as the autumn sunshine above. "Only 50 cents, he called out cheerfully to the stream of people rushing past. "Really pretty rocks and marbles. Great for collections." Most people hurried by without a glance, their shoes click-clacking against the concrete, their faces buried in phones or fixed straight ahead. But Maverick didn't let that dim his spirit. Each time someone new approached, he'd wave enthusiastically and point to his carefully arranged display. "Look at this one," he'd say to anyone who slowed down even slightly. "It sparkles just like a diamond when the sun hits it." He held up a piece of quartz, turning it this way and that to catch the light. The constant rush of traffic provided a steady backdrop to his sales pitch. Cars honking, buses whooshing past, the general hum of city life. A cool breeze ruffled his short curls as he straightened his items for the 100th time, making sure everything looked perfect. Just a few steps away, an older woman sat alone on a weathered wooden bench. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her hands clutched a small golden locket that caught occasional glints of sunlight. This was Miriam, though Maverick didn't know her name yet. Her eyes, tired but kind, kept drifting to the young boy and his makeshift shop. Every few minutes, Miriam's brow would furrow slightly, as if trying to grasp a thought that kept slipping away. Her fingers would trace the pattern on her locket, then pause, then start again. Something about the boy tugged at her memory, but like so many things these days, it remained just out of reach. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, painting the buildings in warm orange light, Maverick started gathering his treasures. He carefully wrapped each item in paper before tucking them into his backpack. The street was quieter now, with fewer people rushing past. Looking up, he noticed Miriam still sitting on the bench. She seemed confused, glancing around as if unsure where she was or how long she'd been there. Without hesitation, Maverick walked over to her, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Hi," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "Are you okay?" Miriam looked up, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, something flickered in her expression, a flash of recognition, though neither of them could understand why. "Oh, hello," she replied, her voice warm despite her apparent weariness. "I was just resting for a bit." "I like your necklace," Maverick said, pointing to the locket she held. "It's really pretty." A small smile crossed Miriam's face. "Thank you, dear. I saw you selling your lovely collections. You're quite the businessman." "I try my best," Maverick grinned, rocking slightly on his heels. "Did you want to see one of my special rocks? I saved the best ones." Their eyes met again, and that strange sense of familiarity washed over them both. It was like meeting someone you've known all your life, even though you've just said hello for the first time. The next morning dawned crisp and clear as Maverick hurried to his usual spot on the street corner. His backpack was stuffed with new treasures he'd collected, bits of sea glass, interesting buttons, and even a few toy cars that Mr. Peterson had given him when cleaning out the mansion's storage room. Maverick arranged everything carefully on his blue cloth, determined to make enough money to show Mr. Peterson that he could be responsible. "Maybe if I earn enough," he whispered to himself, "he'll notice me more at dinner time." As he worked, movement caught his eye. Just a few yards away, Miriam was setting up her own little display. Her weathered hands carefully arranged colorful knitted scarves and mittens on a small folding table. Something about the way she worked, so precise and gentle, made Maverick smile. Without really thinking about it, he wandered over to her table. "Those are really pretty," he said, running his fingers along a soft blue scarf. "Did you make them yourself?" Miriam's face brightened. "I did indeed. My hands remember how, even when my mind gets a bit foggy." She paused, looking at her work. "Would you like to learn? I could show you the basics while we wait for customers." As the morning stretched into midday, they shared stories between occasional sales. Maverick sat cross-legged beside Miriam's table, his small hands awkwardly holding knitting needles as she taught him. "Mr. Peterson's house is huge," Maverick said, concentrating on his stitches. "Sometimes I think I could disappear in there and nobody would even notice." He looked down at his hands. "He's nice and everything, gives me good food and nice clothes, but it doesn't feel like home?" Miriam finished softly, her eyes full of understanding. Maverick nodded. "I want a real family. You know, the kind that asks about your day and hangs your drawings on the fridge." His voice grew quieter. "The kind that sees you." Miriam's hands trembled slightly as she reached for another ball of yarn. Her eyes grew distant as if trying to grasp something just beyond reach. I think I understand that feeling," she said slowly. "Sometimes I feel like I'm missing something very important, but I can't remember what it is." As afternoon crept in, the sky began to darken. The first drops of rain scattered across the sidewalk like tiny diamonds. Customers who had been browsing quickly disappeared, seeking shelter from the approaching storm. Miriam helped Maverick gather his things under her small canopy. The rain grew steadier, drumming against the fabric above them. "They're saying it's going to be quite a storm," she mentioned, wrapping her arms around herself. "Supposed to last through the night." Maverick watched her face carefully. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Miriam's silence was answer enough. She fiddled with her locket, a habit Maverick had noticed whenever she felt uncertain. "Oh, I'll figure something out," she said finally, but her voice wavered. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Maverick thought about the many empty rooms in Mr. Peterson's mansion. He looked at Miriam, who had been so kind to him, teaching him to knit and really listening when he talked. The thought of her alone in the storm made his chest hurt. The rain fell harder now, and Maverick watched as Miriam tried to protect her knitted goods from the growing puddles. His mind raced with possibilities, knowing he needed to do something to help. Thunder cracked overhead as Maverick and Miriam approached the towering iron gates of the Peterson mansion. Rain pelted them mercilessly, turning Miriam's gray hair several shades darker. She stopped short at the entrance, her eyes widening at the sight of the massive stone building looming before them. "Oh, Maverick," she whispered, pulling her worn cardigan tighter around her shoulders. "This is where you live? I couldn't possibly—" Her voice trailed off as she took in the manicured gardens and elaborate fountain now overflowing with rainwater. "Please," Maverick insisted, tugging gently at her hand. "You can't stay out in this storm." Water dripped from his curls as he punched in the security code, something Mr. Peterson had trusted him with just last month. The gates swung open with a low creak. As they made their way up the curved driveway, Miriam's footsteps grew more hesitant. Her simple dress and weathered shoes seemed to shrink against the backdrop of marble columns and gleaming windows. Lightning illuminated the mansion's facade, casting dramatic shadows across its surface. "It's okay," Maverick reassured her, leading her up the wide steps to the front door. "Mr. Peterson has lots of extra rooms. He probably won't even notice." The massive oak door swung open before Maverick could finish his sentence. Mr. Peterson stood in the doorway, his tall frame blocking most of the warm light from inside. His expression hardened as his gaze moved from Maverick to Miriam. "Maverick," he said, his voice clipped and cold. "What is the meaning of this?" They stepped into the foyer, water pooling beneath their feet on the pristine marble floor. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, their light reflecting off the antique mirrors that lined the walls. Miriam seemed to shrink even further under Mr. Peterson's stern gaze. She had nowhere to go, Maverick explained quickly, his voice small but determined. And the storm. We've discussed this before, Mr. Peterson cut in sharply. You cannot bring strangers into our home. It's dangerous and completely inappropriate. He turned to Miriam, his eyes narrowing. I'm sorry, ma'am, but you'll have to leave. Miriam's fingers found her locket, clutching it like a lifeline. I understand you're concerned, sir, she said softly, her voice steady despite her dripping clothes. I'm very grateful that Maverick thought to help me, but I wouldn't want to impose. Please, Mr. Peterson, Maverick pleaded, stepping between them. Just for tonight. She's been teaching me to knit and she's really nice and… Mr. Peterson raised a hand to silence him, pinching the bridge of his nose with his other hand. After a long moment, he sighed. One night, he conceded reluctantly, in the guest wing, and she leaves first thing in the morning. Relief flooded Maverick's face as he led Miriam toward the hallway. The walls were lined with expensive artwork, each piece perfectly positioned in gilded frames. Their footsteps echoed on the marble floor as they passed beneath another crystal chandelier. Suddenly, Miriam stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes were fixed on Maverick's wrist, visible where his wet sleeve had pulled back. There, just below his palm, was a small, distinctive birthmark in the shape of a crescent moon. The color drained from Miriam's face. Her locket slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering to the floor. My baby? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes rolled back, and before anyone could react, she crumpled to the ground. Miriam! Maverick cried out, dropping to his knees beside her. Mr. Peterson rushed forward, his previous suspicion forgotten in the face of emergency. Call an ambulance, he shouted, already reaching for his phone. But Maverick could only stare at Miriam's unconscious form, his small hand instinctively covering the birthmark on his wrist. The guest bedroom's elegant wallpaper and antique furniture seemed to fade into the background as Maverick sat beside Miriam's bed, his small hands clasped tightly in his lap. The household doctor, Dr. Thompson, a kind-faced woman with silver-streaked hair, listened to Miriam's heartbeat with practiced precision. Her vital signs are stable, Dr. Thompson announced, removing her stethoscope. The collapse was likely brought on by stress and exhaustion. She'll need rest, but there's no immediate cause for concern. Miriam's eyes fluttered open, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Her gaze settled on Maverick, and a soft smile crossed her face. I'm sorry if I scared you, she whispered, her voice still weak. I was really worried, Maverick admitted, scooting his chair closer to her bedside. Are you feeling better now? Miriam pushed herself up slightly against the plush pillows, her brow furrowing as she looked around the room. Something about the crown molding, the way the moonlight filtered through the heavy curtains, felt hauntingly familiar. This room? She murmured, then shook her head. I'm sorry, I must sound confused. Everything just feels like I've been here before. Mr. Peterson, who had been hovering near the doorway, exchanged a meaningful look with Dr. Thompson. After a few more routine checks, the doctor packed up her bag and left, leaving behind instructions for rest and hydration. Maverick, Mr. Peterson called firmly. Come with me to my study, now. In the study, leather-bound books lined the walls and a massive mahogany desk dominated the space. Mr. Peterson settled into his chair, fixing Maverick with a stern look. This woman could be anyone, he said, his voice tight with concern. She could be looking for money or worse. You can't just bring strangers into our home. But she's not like that, Maverick protested, his voice rising slightly. She's kind, and she teaches me things, and she listens to me. Really listens. That's exactly what concerns me, Mr. Peterson countered, leaning forward. People can pretend to be kind when they want something. I'm trying to protect you. You don't understand, Maverick insisted, his eyes filling with tears. She's different. I can feel it. Please, can't she stay until she feels better? Mr. Peterson's jaw tightened. One more night, that's all. Then she leaves, and this discussion is over. Near midnight, Maverick crept through the dimly lit hallway, carefully balancing a glass of water. He knocked softly on the guest room door before entering. Miriam sat up in bed, her silver hair catching the moonlight streaming through the window. "I thought you might be thirsty," he said, offering her the glass. "Thank you, sweetheart," Miriam replied, her voice thick with emotion. She took a small sip, then set the glass on the bedside table. "Maverick, I need to tell you something. I know this might sound strange, but I feel connected to you somehow." Her fingers absently touched her locket as she continued. "That birthmark on your wrist. It reminds me of something. Someone." She closed her eyes, struggling to grasp at memories that seemed just out of reach. "My baby had a mark just like that, but I can't remember." Her voice trailed off, frustration evident in her features. Maverick sat on the edge of the bed, his hand unconsciously covering his birthmark. "Really?" he asked softly, his heart beating faster. "What else do you remember?" "Just fragments," Miriam admitted, her eyes glistening with tears. "A nursery with yellow walls, a small teddy bear with one eye, but it's also fuzzy, like trying to see through fog." The morning sun streamed through the mansion's tall windows, casting long shadows across the pristine dining room floor. Miriam stood in the spacious kitchen, her weathered hands carefully arranging fresh fruit on a silver platter. The household staff moved around her with practiced efficiency, though their sideways glances revealed their uncertainty about this stranger in their midst. "Mrs. Cooper," Miriam addressed the head cook gently, "would you like me to help with the pancakes?" The plump cook hesitated, her hands pausing over the mixing bowl. "That won't be necessary, ma'am," she replied stiffly, though her expression softened slightly at Miriam's genuine warmth. Mr. Peterson sat at the head of the long dining table, his newspaper creating a barrier between himself and the morning's activities. His coffee remained untouched, growing cold as he pretended to read the same page for the third time. Maverick bounded into the dining room, his school uniform slightly rumpled. His face lit up when he saw Miriam placing the fruit platter on the table. "You're still here," he exclaimed, earning a sharp look from Mr. Peterson. "Just helping with breakfast," Miriam said softly, smoothing Maverick's collar with natural tenderness. From her pocket, she pulled out a small knitted pouch. "I made this last night. It's for your marbles, so they won't roll away when you're selling them." Maverick's eyes widened with delight as he examined the intricate stitching. "How did you make this? Will you teach me?" Mr. Peterson lowered his newspaper slightly, watching the exchange with guarded eyes. Later that day, in a sunny corner of the mansion's lounge, Maverick sat cross-legged on a plush ottoman while Miriam demonstrated basic knitting stitches. Afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, creating patterns on the carpet. "Where did you learn to make things like this?" Maverick asked, fumbling with the yarn. Miriam's hands slowed, her eyes growing distant. "I used to work with children, I think. In a school, maybe." She shook her head, frustrated by the fog in her memories. "I remember tiny hands learning to tie shoelaces, and story time." Her voice trailed off. Without warning, she began to hum a gentle melody, a lullaby that seemed to float in the air like dust motes in the sunbeams. Maverick's fingers stopped moving, the knitting needles going still in his hands. Something about the tune made his heart ache with recognition. "I know that song," he whispered, though he couldn't remember where he'd heard it before. Miriam's humming faltered, her eyes growing moist. "I used to sing it to someone special." Meanwhile, in his private office, Mr. Peterson sat before his computer, scrolling through background check results. His fingers drummed against the mahogany desk as he read through police records, newspaper archives, and missing persons reports. Nothing suspicious appeared, but the lack of information only heightened his unease. He picked up his phone, dialing his private investigator. "I need more thorough research on a Miriam." He paused, realizing he didn't even know her last name. Just Miriam. Late 50s, possible connection to education or childcare. Outside in the hallway, Miriam stood quietly, her locket open in her palm. Inside, a tiny photograph showed a smiling baby with a distinctive mark on his wrist. Her thumb traced the image as she listened to Maverick's laughter drifting from the lounge. The sound stirred something deep within her, a protective instinct she couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. The mansion's grandfather clock chimed 3 times, its sound echoing through the vast spaces, marking another hour of growing connections and mounting tensions beneath the Peterson roof. The morning light filtered through the dining room's heavy curtains as Mr. Peterson methodically buttered his toast, his stern gaze fixed on Miriam. The silence stretched uncomfortably until he finally spoke, his voice carrying a sharp edge. "So, Miriam," he said, setting down his knife with precise movements, "tell us about yourself. Where exactly did you work before all this?" Miriam's hands trembled slightly as she held her teacup. "I wish I could tell you more clearly," she began, her voice soft but steady. "There was an accident, you see. The doctor said the trauma affected my memories." "An accident?" Mr. Peterson pressed, leaning forward. "What kind of accident?" Maverick watched the exchange, his breakfast forgotten as Miriam's face clouded with confusion and distress. "I remember fragments. A hospital stay, rehabilitation." She touched her locket unconsciously. "But mostly, I remember this feeling of searching, like I've lost something precious, or someone, and I need to find them." Mr. Peterson's eyes narrowed. "That's rather convenient, isn't it? No memories, no way to verify your story." "Mr. Peterson," Maverick interrupted, his young voice filled with indignation. "She's not lying. Can't you see how much it hurts her to talk about it?" The businessman's expression softened slightly at Maverick's outburst, but his suspicion remained evident in his rigid posture. Later that morning, Maverick and Miriam sat together on the mansion's wide balcony. Potted plants surrounded them, creating a peaceful haven above the manicured gardens below. Miriam's knitting needles clicked softly as she guided Maverick's hands through a simple pattern. "Maybe we could help you remember," Maverick suggested, his face brightening with the idea. "Like detectives, we could look for clues about your past." Miriam's hand stilled and she smiled warmly at the boy. "That's very kind of you, dear." She showed him how to loop the yarn. "Like this, see? Just like making a chain of memories, one stitch at a time." Maverick concentrated on the movement, his tongue sticking out slightly. "The mansion feels different with you here," he admitted quietly. "Less empty." Meanwhile, near the mansion's wrought iron gates, Mr. Peterson stood in the shadow of an old oak tree. A man in a nondescript gray suit approached, his movements precise and professional. "Everything I could gather is in here," Mr. Peterson said, handing over a thin manila folder. "Her approximate age, physical description, the few details she's shared about her supposed accident." The private investigator thumbed through the papers. "Not much to go on." "That's why I'm paying you generously," Mr. Peterson replied curtly. "I need to know who she really is. Background checks, hospital records, anything you can find. And I need it quickly." "Understood, Mr. Peterson." The investigator tucked the folder into his briefcase. "Any particular areas of concern?" Mr. Peterson's jaw tightened as he glanced up at the balcony where Maverick and Miriam sat. "Everything about her story feels off. The convenient memory loss, the way she's attached herself to Maverick." He paused, his voice hardening. "I won't let anyone disrupt what I've built here, not again." The investigator nodded, understanding the unspoken urgency in his client's words. As he walked away, Mr. Peterson remained by the gates, watching the peaceful scene on the balcony with growing unease. The early morning sun cast long shadows through the kitchen windows as Miriam worked alongside the mansion staff. Her hands moved with natural grace as she measured flour into a large mixing bowl. The kitchen, usually a place of quiet efficiency, now held the warm scent of fresh-baked bread and brewing coffee. Maverick poked his head around the doorframe, still in his pajamas, his curly hair tousled from sleep. "Something smells amazing," he exclaimed, padding into the kitchen on bare feet. Miriam's face lit up at the sight of him. "Well, good morning, early bird. Want to be my official taste tester?" The kitchen staff exchanged subtle glances, unused to such casual warmth in the normally austere mansion. Mrs. Chen, the head cook, couldn't help but smile as she watched Maverick climb onto a stool next to Miriam. "Here, Miriam said, dusting flour on the counter. "Let me show you how to roll out dough for pastries." She guided Maverick's small hands, helping him press the rolling pin back and forth. "Not too hard now. Think of it like petting a cat, gentle but firm." Maverick giggled as flour dusted his nose. "Like this?" "Perfect. You're a natural." Miriam's voice carried a hint of pride that made Maverick beam. Together, they shaped the dough into simple crescents, Maverick's slightly lopsided, but made with enthusiasm. The staff worked around them, sneaking fond looks at the pair. Even Thomas, the usually stoic butler, found himself humming along when Miriam started singing a quiet tune while they worked. Later, in the grand dining room, Mr. Peterson entered to find the formal space transformed. The usual stark breakfast setting had been replaced by warm pastries arranged on painted plates, fresh flowers in a crystal vase, and the sound of Maverick's cheerful chatter. Mr. Peterson paused in the doorway, his newspaper tucked under his arm, clearly thrown by the change in atmosphere. He took his seat stiffly, eyeing the homemade breakfast with suspicion. "Mr. Peterson," Miriam began softly, "I wanted to thank you again for your hospitality. I've tried to help where I can with the cooking." "Yes, well," he cut her off, reaching for his coffee. "Let's not make too much of it." Maverick, sensing the tension, quickly jumped in. "Mr. Peterson, guess what? The science fair is next week. I'm doing my project on how plants grow in different types of light. Miriam helped me set up the experiments yesterday." Mr. Peterson's jaw tightened at this news, but before he could respond, the butler appeared with more coffee. After breakfast in a dimly lit side corridor, Mr. Peterson cornered Miriam as she carried a stack of linens. "A word," he said, his tone brooking no argument. Miriam set down her burden, facing him with quiet dignity. "I expect to hear from my investigator very soon," he stated bluntly, "about your background." "Mr. Peterson?" Miriam replied, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "I understand your concern, but I truly don't remember much before finding myself in this city. I wish I could tell you more." "And I'm supposed to simply accept that?" His eyes narrowed. "Your convenient appearance, your immediate attachment to Maverick?" "I have no ulterior motives," Miriam insisted. "I'm just trying to find my way, to be useful where I can." Mr. Peterson straightened his tie, his expression hardening. "Don't get too comfortable. This is temporary." He turned on his heel, leaving Miriam standing alone in the shadowy corridor, her hands clutched together near her heart. Sunlight streamed through Maverick's bedroom window as he sat cross-legged on his plush carpet, carefully sorting through his prized collection of trinkets. Small figurines, colorful marbles, and shiny buttons lay scattered around him like precious gems. Each item held a special memory, a tiny piece of his journey through different foster homes. Miriam knocked softly on the open door. "Need any help tidying up?" "Sure." Maverick smiled, making space for her to sit beside him. As Miriam entered the room, her eyes were drawn to the wall where several crayon drawings hung, secured with blue painter's tape. The artwork showed simple but emotional scenes. A small boy standing alone, a woman with no face, and question marks floating like clouds above them. But what caught her attention was a distinct mark on the boy's wrist in one of the drawings, a shape that matched Maverick's birthmark perfectly. Miriam's hand instinctively went to her locket. Her chest tightened as she studied the drawing, something tugging at the edges of her fragmented memories. "I drew those," Maverick said proudly, noticing her interest. "That's me, and—" He paused, his voice growing quieter. "I guess that's my mom. I don't remember her face, though." Later that afternoon, with Mr. Peterson away at a business meeting, Maverick convinced James, the household driver, to take them to the local craft store. "It's for my science fair project," he explained earnestly. "We need display materials." The craft store's bell chimed as they entered. Miriam inhaled deeply. The familiar scent of yarn and paper stirred something in her mind. She ran her fingers along skeins of soft yarn, each color seeming to whisper forgotten stories. "These blues would look nice for your display," she suggested to Maverick, but her voice sounded distant. The fluorescent lights suddenly seemed too bright, transforming into stark, hospital hallway lighting in her mind. The memory hit her like a physical force. Antiseptic smell, squeaking shoes on linoleum, a deep sense of loss. "Miriam?" Maverick's worried voice brought her back. "Are you okay?" She blinked rapidly, steadying herself against a shelf. "Yes, dear. Just remembering something, I think." They gathered their supplies quickly, poster board, markers, and some yarn for Miriam's nervous hands to work with. The mansion's grand front doors had barely closed behind them when Mr. Peterson's voice rang out from the foyer. "Where have you been?" His early return caught them off guard, shopping bags rustling in their startled hands. "Mr. Peterson," Maverick stepped forward. "We just went to get stuff for my science fair project. Look!" He held up the poster board enthusiastically. Mr. Peterson's stern gaze moved from the bags to Miriam's face. "And this required both of you to leave the house?" "I needed help choosing the right materials," Maverick explained, his smile faltering slightly. "Maverick has been working very hard on his experiment," Miriam added softly. "We thought it would be nice to have a proper display for his results." Mr. Peterson straightened his tie, a habit that betrayed his discomfort. "In the future, any outings need to be cleared with me first. Is that understood?" His tone left no room for discussion. "Keep your activities confined to the house unless absolutely necessary." Maverick nodded, clutching his craft supplies closer. Miriam placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, feeling him lean slightly into her touch. The gesture wasn't lost on Mr. Peterson, whose frown deepened as he watched their subtle interaction. The mahogany-paneled study felt particularly oppressive as Mr. Peterson stood by his desk, fingers drumming impatiently on its polished surface. The private investigator, a weathered man in his 50s named Frank Morris, sat in one of the leather chairs, spreading out a thin folder of documents. "This is all you found?" Mr. Peterson's voice was tight with frustration. Morris adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. "So far, we've checked recent hospital records, police reports, and missing persons databases. Nothing concrete has turned up about Miriam's identity or past." "That's not good enough." Mr. Peterson loosened his tie, pacing behind his desk. "She's living in my house, spending time with my foster son. I need to know who she is." "Understanding your concern, Mr. Peterson." Morris leaned forward. "But cases involving memory loss are complex. We're expanding our search to older hospital records and adoption databases next. Sometimes these situations require patience." Mr. Peterson's jaw clenched. "Patience isn't a luxury I can afford right now. That woman could be anyone. Or she could be exactly who she appears to be, someone who's lost and confused." Morris gathered his papers carefully. "Give me another week. I'll focus on medical records from about 8 years ago, around the time frame she mentioned." Outside in the hallway, Maverick pressed himself against the wall, heart pounding as he listened. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but hearing Miriam's name had stopped him in his tracks. As Morris left the study, Maverick gathered his courage and followed the investigator toward the front door. "Mr. Morris?" Maverick's small voice echoed in the marble foyer. "Can I ask you something?" The investigator turned, his stern face softening at the sight of the boy. "What's on your mind, son?" "Are you looking for information about Miriam?" Maverick fidgeted with the hem of his shirt. "Did you find anything about where she came from?" Morris knelt down to Maverick's level, his eyes kind behind his glasses. "I'm doing my best to help piece together her story. These things take time, though. Sometimes the truth is like a puzzle. We have to find all the pieces before we can see the whole picture." "But you will find out, right?" Hope filled Maverick's voice. "She really wants to remember." "I promise I'm trying my hardest." Morris patted Maverick's shoulder. "You care about her a lot, don't you?" Maverick nodded earnestly. "She makes everything feel warmer here." Later that evening, Maverick knocked on Miriam's guest room door, finding her sitting in a rocking chair with her knitting. The soft click of needles paused as she looked up. "I heard Mr. Morris talking to Mr. Peterson," Maverick admitted, closing the door behind him. "They're looking through old records to find out about your past." Miriam's hands trembled slightly as she set her knitting aside. "I suspected as much. Mr. Peterson wants to make sure I'm not dangerous. Are you scared? Maverick moved closer, noticing the worry in her eyes. A little, Miriam admitted, touching her locket. What if my memories are gone for a reason? What if the truth is sad? Tears welled in her eyes, and Maverick stepped forward, wrapping his arms around her in a tight hug. Miriam held him close, her tears falling softly into his curly hair. Whatever they find out, Maverick whispered, you'll still be you. The you that makes cookies and teaches me knitting and listens to my stories. Miriam's embrace tightened, her voice thick with emotion. Oh, sweetheart, how did you get so wise? They stayed like that for a long moment, finding comfort in each other's presence as the evening shadows lengthened across the room. The autumn morning painted the Peterson mansion's backyard in rich golds and crimsons. Maverick bounded through piles of fallen leaves while Miriam followed behind, carrying a wicker basket for collecting specimens. Look at this one, Miriam. Maverick held up a maple leaf, its edges tinged with deep red. The book says the color change happens because of chlorophyll breaking down. Miriam smiled warmly, adding the leaf to their growing collection. That's fascinating, sweetheart. What else does your textbook say? Maverick plopped down on a nearby bench, flipping through his science book. We're learning about cell structure in medical terms, too, like how leukocytes are white blood cells that help fight infection. Miriam's hand suddenly trembled, the basket slipping from her grasp. The word leukocytes triggered something deep within her mind. A stark white hospital corridor, the sound of beeping machines, plastic wristbands. Miriam? Maverick's worried voice cut through her haze. Are you okay? She steadied herself against the bench. I'm fine, dear. Just another memory flash. Perhaps we should sit for a moment. Maverick guided her to the bench, his small hand holding hers. Was it about the hospital again? Yes, Miriam whispered, touching her locket. Something about medical tests, I think, but it's still so foggy. Their quiet moment was interrupted by footsteps on the garden path. Mr. Peterson appeared, his tailored suit looking out of place among the scattered leaves. Is everything all right here? His eyes narrowed, focusing on Miriam's pale face. You seem unwell, Miriam. Or is this another convenient episode? Mr. Peterson, Miriam replied softly, maintaining her composure. I understand your skepticism, but I assure you these memory flashes are genuine. The accident that took my memories. Yes, the mysterious accident you can't remember, Mr. Peterson cut in. How convenient. Please, Maverick stepped forward, his voice small but determined. She's not pretending. I saw how scared she looked just now. Mr. Peterson's expression softened slightly at Maverick's defense, but his voice remained firm. I'm watching out for your safety, Maverick. You understand that, don't you? Yes, sir, Maverick nodded. But Miriam would never hurt me. Mr. Peterson adjusted his tie, looking directly at Miriam. For Maverick's sake, I hope you're telling the truth. But know that I'm keeping a very close eye on this situation. Later that afternoon, Miriam sat in the kitchen's breakfast nook, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a small project. The yarn was soft and blue, gradually taking the shape of a tiny stuffed elephant, something to comfort Maverick during his upcoming science fair presentation. As she worked, a familiar melody rose in her throat, the lullaby she couldn't quite place. The gentle tune filled the quiet kitchen, and suddenly another memory surfaced. A tiny hand gripping her finger, so small and precious. The image was crystal clear for just a moment before fading away like morning mist. Tears rolled down Miriam's cheeks, dropping onto the half-finished elephant. She wiped them away quickly, determined to stay strong. Whatever these memories meant, whatever truth lay hidden in her past, she knew one thing for certain. Her connection to Maverick felt real and precious, something worth protecting. Her fingers resumed their steady rhythm with the needles, the elephant taking shape stitch by stitch, just as her memories seemed to be slowly piecing themselves together. The school auditorium buzzed with activity as students arranged their science fair displays across the stage. Maverick stood at his station, carefully organizing his leaf specimens while rehearsing his presentation under his breath. His small hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the poster board showing the process of photosynthesis. Miriam slipped quietly through the auditorium doors, clutching the blue knitted elephant she'd finished the night before. Her heart swelled at the sight of Maverick in his neatly pressed school uniform, looking so grown up despite his young age. "Who are you here for?" A teacher approached Miriam with a clipboard, her pencil poised. "Maverick," Miriam answered softly, her eyes never leaving the stage. "I'm staying with his family." The teacher's brow furrowed. "Oh? I thought Mr. Peterson was his guardian. Are you related?" Before Miriam could respond, the familiar lullaby floated through her mind as Maverick spotted her and waved enthusiastically. The melody seemed stronger here, more insistent, as if trying to tell her something important. Pride and protectiveness washed over her as she watched him straighten his tie and begin his practice presentation. "I'm just here to support him," Miriam explained, clutching her purse tightly. Several other teachers glanced her way, whispering among themselves. During a break in the rehearsal, Miriam stepped out to clear her head. A small cafe across the street beckoned, promising quiet and coffee. She settled into a corner booth, ordering a simple black coffee to calm her nerves. As steam rose from her cup, another memory struck her with surprising clarity. The stark white walls of a hospital room materialized in her mind. A tiny baby boy, wrapped in blue, squirmed in her arms. His tiny wrist bore a distinctive mark, the same crescent-shaped birthmark that Maverick had. The memory was so vivid she could almost smell the antiseptic hospital air. Her hands shaking, Miriam grabbed a napkin and the pen from her purse. She scribbled frantically, desperate to capture every detail before it slipped away. Birthmark, crescent shape, hospital, white walls, blue blanket, baby boy. My baby boy. The words came in a rush, disjointed but precious. That evening, in the mansion's living room, Miriam showed Maverick the napkin. They sat close together on the plush sofa, heads bent over the scrawled words. "See here?" Miriam pointed to the word birthmark. "I remembered something about a baby with a mark just like yours." Maverick's eyes widened. "Really? Do you think—" "I'm not sure, dear," Miriam said gently, "but these memories feel so real. The hospital room was so clear this time." "Could I be—" Maverick started, hope lighting up his face. The sound of expensive leather shoes on hardwood interrupted them. Mr. Peterson stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he noticed the napkin between them. "What's this?" he asked, stepping into the room. His voice was controlled but carried an edge of suspicion. "Miriam remembered something today," Maverick explained excitedly. "About a baby with—" "I expect complete honesty in this house, Miriam," Mr. Peterson cut in, raising an eyebrow. "Whatever game you're playing—" "No game," Miriam said quietly, holding the napkin close. "Just fragments of memories I'm trying to understand." Mr. Peterson's jaw tightened as he looked between them, the tension in the room growing thick. "We'll discuss this later," he said firmly, making it clear the conversation wasn't over. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through Mr. Peterson's study as he sat behind his mahogany desk, fingers drumming nervously on its polished surface. The private investigator, a weathered man in his 50s, placed a manila folder carefully between them. "Mr. Peterson, what I've found—" The investigator paused, choosing his words carefully. "There are hospital records from 8 years ago. A woman named Miriam Davis was admitted after a severe accident. The details match many of our assumptions about your house guest." Mr. Peterson leaned forward, his usually stern face showing a flicker of concern. "Go on." "The records are incomplete, but they show something significant." The investigator pulled out a photocopied document. This Miriam Davis had just given birth to a baby boy. There's a specific note about a distinctive crescent-shaped birthmark on the infant's wrist. The color drained from Mr. Peterson's face. He'd seen that exact mark on Maverick's wrist countless times. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the document. "The woman disappeared from the hospital during her recovery," the investigator continued. "The baby was never found. The case went cold after months of searching. Mr. Peterson stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This can't be possible. Maverick came through proper channels. The adoption agency. Sometimes paperwork gets falsified, sir, especially with private adoptions. Running a hand through his graying hair, Mr. Peterson felt his world tilting sideways. The thought of losing Maverick made his chest tight with panic. Stepping out of his study moments later, his mind racing with implications, he nearly walked straight into Miriam. She stood in the hallway, a concerned expression crossing her face as she noticed his distress. "Mr. Peterson, are you all right?" Her voice was gentle, caring, the same tone she used with Maverick. He struggled to find words, seeing her in a new light. "We need to protect Maverick. From false hope. He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Miriam's eyes widened slightly, sensing something significant had changed. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken possibilities. Later that evening, the mansion's sitting room felt unusually small despite its grand size. Mr. Peterson had called both Miriam and Maverick to join him. Maverick perched on the edge of an antique armchair, while Miriam sat quietly on the sofa, her hands folded in her lap. "There have been developments," Mr. Peterson began, his voice carefully controlled. "The investigator found hospital records that might be connected to you, Miriam." Maverick sat up straighter, his eyes darting between the adults. Miriam's hands tightened in her lap, but she remained silent. "These records suggest a connection that could be significant." Mr. Peterson's professional demeanor cracked slightly. "But we need to be extremely careful here. There are laws about custody and proper procedures that must be followed. Even if these records prove accurate, nothing is simple or immediate." "What kind of records?" Maverick asked eagerly. Mr. Peterson held up a hand. "I don't want either of you jumping to conclusions or getting your hopes up. These things take time to verify. And even then..." He looked directly at Miriam, his voice softening despite himself. "We need to protect everyone involved from potential heartbreak." The word heartbreak hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Mr. Peterson's usual confidence wavered as he watched Maverick unconsciously touch his wrist, where the crescent birthmark lay hidden under his sleeve. For the first time since Miriam's arrival, real fear showed in Mr. Peterson's eyes. Not fear of deception, but fear of losing the boy he'd come to love as his own. The early morning sunlight filtered through the mansion's tall windows, casting a gentle glow across the living room. Maverick sat cross-legged on the plush carpet, carefully studying the coffee-stained napkin covered in Miriam's hurried handwriting. His fingers traced each word with careful attention. Birthmark, hospital, baby boy. Miriam found him there, still in her borrowed nightgown from the mansion's collection. She paused in the doorway, watching his concentrated expression with a mixture of tenderness and uncertainty. "I couldn't sleep," Maverick admitted without looking up. "I kept thinking about what these words might mean." Miriam settled beside him on the carpet, her movements careful and quiet in the early morning stillness. "I know, sweetheart. I had trouble sleeping too." "The birthmark." Maverick rolled up his sleeve, revealing the distinctive crescent shape on his wrist. "You saw something like this in your memory, didn't you?" Miriam's breath caught in her throat. "Yes," she whispered. "In the hospital room. The baby. He had the same mark, exactly where yours is." Maverick's eyes sparkled with barely contained excitement. "Do you think... could it really mean..." He couldn't quite finish the question, but his hopeful expression said everything. "We need to be careful," Miriam said gently, though her own heart was racing. "Like Mr. Peterson said, we can't jump to conclusions, but..." She reached out and squeezed his hand. "I feel it too. This connection between us. It's been there since that first day on the street corner." In Mr. Peterson's private office, the atmosphere was considerably tenser. The private investigator spread several documents across the desk, while Mr. Peterson paced behind his chair, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks. The birthmark description is exact, the investigator explained, pointing to a highlighted section. Crescent-shaped, approximately 1 inch in length, located on the right wrist. The hospital records are quite specific about this detail. Mr. Peterson gripped the back of his chair until his knuckles turned white. There must be other children with similar marks. It's not conclusive. Sir, the investigator said carefully, the timing matches perfectly. The accident that caused Miriam's memory loss, the missing baby, Maverick's approximate age. It all lines up. I won't lose him, Mr. Peterson muttered, more to himself than to the investigator. He's been in my care for years. I've given him everything. The courts will consider that, the investigator offered. But if she is his biological mother— Find more proof, Mr. Peterson interrupted sharply. I need absolute certainty before I'll accept this. Later that morning, Miriam stood in the hallway outside Mr. Peterson's office, watching the investigator leave with his briefcase full of documents. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached him. Excuse me, she called softly. Did you find anything new about my past? The investigator paused, offering her a kind but professional smile. It's best you speak with Mr. Peterson about the findings, ma'am. Miriam nodded, pressing one hand against her locket. Something in the investigator's careful expression told her there were important discoveries within those files. She straightened her shoulders, gathering her courage. Whatever truth lay in those documents, she would face it. For herself, and for Maverick. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Peterson mansion's dining room as an uncomfortable silence hung over lunch. Miriam pushed her food around the plate, her appetite lost to the anxiety gnawing at her stomach. Across the table, Maverick darted concerned glances between her and Mr. Peterson, who maintained a rigid posture and stone-faced expression. The quiet was broken only by the soft clink of silverware, until Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. The investigator has located additional hospital records, he announced, his voice carefully controlled. They should arrive within days. Miriam's hand trembled slightly as she set down her fork. Thank you for telling me, she said softly. Mr. Peterson's jaw tightened. I would advise you, he continued, his tone growing stern, not to fill Maverick's head with impossible fantasies. The boy has been through enough upheaval in his young life. The following afternoon, golden sunlight filtered through the trees at the small park near Maverick's school. Miriam and Maverick sat together on a worn wooden bench, watching families enjoy the pleasant weather. A young mother pushed her daughter on the swings, their shared laughter carrying across the playground. Miriam felt her eyes growing misty as she observed the scene. She tried to blink away the tears, but Maverick noticed immediately. Are you okay? He asked, his small hand finding hers. Yes, sweetheart, she replied, squeezing his hand gently. Sometimes watching families together makes my heart feel very full. Maverick was quiet for a moment, watching a father teach his son how to throw a baseball. Sometimes, he began hesitantly, when we're together like this, I imagine what it would be like to call you Mom. Miriam's heart seemed to expand and break simultaneously. Joy and sorrow mingled in her chest as she struggled to find the right words. Oh, Maverick, she whispered, pulling him close for a gentle hug. That evening, the upstairs corridor of the mansion echoed with Maverick's excited voice as he chatted with Miriam about their afternoon. And then we saw the prettiest butterfly, and Miriam knew exactly what kind it was. Mr. Peterson emerged from his study, his expression darkening as he observed their interaction. He waited until Maverick had disappeared into his room before approaching Miriam. A word, he said curtly, leading her to a quiet corner of the hallway. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with Maverick. This has gone far enough. What do you mean? Miriam asked, standing straighter than she had in days. You're giving him false hope, Mr. Peterson accused, his voice low but intense. I've worked too hard to provide him stability, and you're undermining everything with these maternal overtures. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, Miriam felt her timidity fall away completely. Maverick deserves to know the truth, she stated firmly, meeting Mr. Peterson's gaze. If I truly am his mother— If, Mr. Peterson cut her off. That's all this is, maybes and what-ifs. Meanwhile, You're confusing a vulnerable child who's finally found some stability in his life." "I would never intentionally hurt him," Miriam insisted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Mr. Peterson's face flushed with anger. "This ends now," he snapped, turning sharply on his heel and storming down the corridor, leaving Miriam standing alone in the dimly lit hallway. The morning sunlight streamed through Mr. Peterson's office windows as he sat behind his mahogany desk, hands trembling slightly as he accepted a thick manila envelope from the private investigator. The investigator's face was solemn as he watched Mr. Peterson extract the documents. "Everything's there, sir," the investigator said quietly. "Hospital records, birth certificate, and most importantly, the nurse's statement." Mr. Peterson's eyes scanned the papers, his face growing paler with each line he read. The documentation was irrefutable. Miriam Davis had given birth to a baby boy on March 15th, 8 years ago. The infant's distinctive birthmark was clearly documented, matching Maverick's exactly. His fingers lingered over the nurse's written statement, which detailed a tragic accident that had left Miriam with severe head trauma shortly after the birth. "She disappeared from the hospital while still recovering," the investigator explained gently. "The trauma affected her memory significantly. According to the staff, she kept asking about her baby even in her confused state." Mr. Peterson leaned back in his chair, the weight of reality settling heavily on his shoulders. After years of providing Maverick with everything money could buy, here was proof that the boy had a biological mother who hadn't abandoned him by choice. By midday, the mansion's library had become the stage for a moment that would change all their lives. Sunbeams filtered through tall windows, dust motes dancing in the air as Mr. Peterson cleared his throat, facing Miriam and Maverick, who sat together on the leather sofa. "I've received conclusive documentation," he began, his voice unusually strained. "The hospital records show that on March 15th, 8 years ago, a woman named Miriam Davis gave birth to a baby boy." Maverick sat forward eagerly, his small hand finding Miriam's. Mr. Peterson continued reading, his voice growing thicker as he described the distinctive birthmark, identical to Maverick's. When he held up a faded photograph showing a tiny wrist with the telltale mark, Miriam's breath caught audibly. "There's more," Mr. Peterson said, shuffling the papers. "A nurse's statement details an accident that caused severe head trauma, leading to memory loss and—" He paused, glancing at Miriam. "Your disappearance from the hospital." "I knew it," Maverick exclaimed, bouncing slightly on the sofa. "I knew there was a reason we felt so close." "Maverick," Mr. Peterson cautioned, his businessman's composure cracking slightly. "We still need legal confirmation. These things take time and proper channels." Later that afternoon, in the quiet sanctuary of her guest room, Miriam finally allowed her carefully maintained composure to crumble. Tears streamed down her face as 8 years of lost memories and maternal love overwhelmed her. Maverick sat beside her on the bed, his small arms wrapped around her shoulders. "I'm so sorry I was gone," she whispered between sobs, rocking slightly. "I'm so sorry, my baby. I never meant to leave you." "It's okay," Maverick soothed, his voice carrying a wisdom beyond his years. "You didn't know. You couldn't remember." Miriam clutched her locket, the metal warm against her palm. In the background, a bird's song drifted through the window, reminiscent of the lullaby that had haunted her dreams for years. She held Maverick closer, her tears gradually slowing as determination replaced her grief. She would make up for every lost moment, every missed milestone, every night without a mother's goodnight kiss. The morning light cast long shadows across the Peterson mansion's marble foyer as Mr. Peterson greeted his personal attorney, Richard Barnes. The lawyer's polished shoes clicked against the floor as they walked toward the study, their voices low but carrying through the high-ceilinged space. "The hospital records are quite clear," Mr. Peterson was saying, his jaw tight with tension. "But there must be some legal precedent we can use here." Miriam stood frozen in the adjoining room, her hand pressed against the wall for support. Through the partially open door, fragments of their conversation drifted to her ears. "Custody battles can be complex," Barnes responded, shuffling through his briefcase. Given your years as Maverick's guardian, we might have grounds for blocking rights." Miriam's heart seemed to stop. The words hit her like physical blows, each one stealing her breath. She pressed her other hand to her mouth, stifling a gasp as she realized Mr. Peterson intended to fight her claim to Maverick legally. Later that morning, Miriam gathered her courage and approached Barnes in the hallway outside the meeting room. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced between them. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Mr. Barnes," she said, meeting his eyes, "I need to know what's being planned regarding Maverick." The attorney adjusted his tie, looking uncomfortable but maintaining his professional demeanor. "Mr. Peterson has asked me to explore all legal options regarding Maverick's custody situation. He wants to ensure he's prepared for any developments." "You mean he's preparing to fight me?" Miriam said softly, her voice carrying a note of pain. "Even with proof that I'm Maverick's mother." Barnes cleared his throat. "Mr. Peterson has been Maverick's legal guardian for years. He's simply protecting his interests." Miriam felt her chest tighten as the reality of her situation crashed over her. She might have found her son, but now she faced losing him all over again, this time to courtrooms and legal documents instead of accident-induced amnesia. That afternoon, Maverick sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, watching Miriam with worried eyes. Outside his door, household staff members whispered about lawyers and custody forms, their hushed voices carrying an edge of tension that even an 8-year-old could understand. "Are they going to make you leave?" Maverick asked, his small fingers fidgeting with the edge of his shirt. Miriam knelt beside him, taking his hands in hers. The afternoon sun streaming through his window caught the tears gathering in her eyes, making them shimmer. "Listen to me carefully, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I have lost you once. I won't lose you again." Maverick launched himself into her arms, burying his face against her shoulder. His small body trembled slightly as he held onto her with all his strength. "Promise?" he whispered. "I promise," Miriam responded, running her hand soothingly over his back. "We belong together, and I will do whatever it takes to make sure we stay together." Through the open door, they could hear more whispered conversations about legal proceedings and custody rights. Miriam held Maverick tighter, her maternal instincts surging stronger than ever. The memory loss had stolen 8 years from them, but she wouldn't let anyone, not even Mr. Peterson with all his wealth and influence, steal their future together. Miriam sat in the modest law office of Ms. Alvarez, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The morning sun filtered through dusty Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the worn carpet. The small desk between them was cluttered with papers and coffee-stained legal books. "So, these hospital records confirm you're Maverick's biological mother?" Ms. Alvarez asked, adjusting her reading glasses as she studied the documents. "Yes," Miriam replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The birthmark matches exactly, and the dates align with my accident and memory loss." Ms. Alvarez nodded thoughtfully, making notes on a yellow legal pad. "The evidence is compelling, Mrs. Davis. Your case for maternal rights is strong." She paused, looking up at Miriam with kind but serious eyes. "However, I must warn you that Mr. Peterson's resources could make this very difficult." "What do you mean?" Miriam asked, though she already knew the answer. "He has connections, money for the best attorneys, and a proven track record as Maverick's guardian." Ms. Alvarez leaned forward. "But don't lose heart. The law recognizes biological parents' rights, especially when there's no evidence of willful abandonment." Back at the Peterson mansion, Miriam returned to find raised voices coming from the living room. Her heart sank as she approached the ornate double doors. "Stand up straight when I'm speaking to you," Mr. Peterson's stern voice carried through the room. "And look at me when I'm talking to you about respect." Miriam entered to find Maverick standing rigidly before Mr. Peterson, his small shoulders hunched and his eyes downcast. The boy's lower lip trembled slightly. "Is everything all right?" Miriam asked, keeping her voice deliberately calm despite the anger rising in her chest. Mr. Peterson turned, his expression hardening. "I'm merely establishing necessary boundaries and rules. Maverick needs structure." He needs love and understanding, Miriam countered, moving to stand beside Maverick. She could feel him trembling. Not fear. I won't have you questioning my parenting methods, Mr. Peterson snapped. I've raised him successfully for years. Through intimidation? Miriam's words were quiet but firm. That's not raising a child, Mr. Peterson. That's controlling one. The tension in the room grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Mr. Peterson's face reddened, but before he could respond, Miriam gently placed her hand on Maverick's shoulder. Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you a snack. Later that evening, Miriam sat with Maverick in her guest room. The setting sun painted the walls in warm oranges and pinks, creating a cozy atmosphere that belied the day's tensions. I saw a lawyer today, Miriam explained softly, watching Maverick's face carefully. Her name is Ms. Alvarez, and she's going to help us. Help us how? Maverick asked, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. She's going to help make sure we can stay together legally. Miriam reached out to still his nervous fingers. But I need you to know something might happen called a custody battle. Tears welled up in Maverick's eyes. I don't want to lose either of you, he whispered. Even when Mr. Peterson is strict, he still takes care of me. But you... He looked up at Miriam, his voice catching. You make me feel like I belong somewhere. Miriam pulled him close, her own eyes filling with tears. Listen to me, she said, her voice thick with emotion. We will find a way to make this work. I promise you won't have to choose between us. Somehow we'll find a way to be a family, all of us. Maverick buried his face in her shoulder, his small frame shaking with quiet sobs. You promise? I promise, Miriam whispered, holding him tighter. No matter what form it takes, we'll be a family. The morning sun cast long shadows across Mr. Peterson's mahogany desk as his phone rang sharply. His attorney's voice crackled through the speaker with news that made his stomach drop. Mr. Peterson, I've just received notice. Miriam Davis has retained legal counsel through Morton & Associates. They're preparing to file for custody. Mr. Peterson's polished shoes clicked against the hardwood floor as he paced, his free hand clenched into a tight fist. This can't be happening, not again. The memory of his own child's loss years ago surged forward, threatening to overwhelm him. We need to act quickly, his attorney continued. We should consider... I will not fail Maverick, Mr. Peterson cut in, his voice raw with emotion. I've given him everything. Structure, opportunity, security. She can't just walk in and... His words trailed off as anger replaced his initial fear. She has no right at all. The morning dragged into midday, and through his office window, Mr. Peterson spotted movement in the garden below. Miriam and Maverick had set up a small table, scattered with beakers and colorful liquids for his science fair project. His chest tightened as he watched them work together. Maverick carefully measured blue liquid into a container while Miriam held the beaker steady. Suddenly, the mixture bubbled over, creating a small, harmless foam explosion. Their laughter drifted up to the window, light and genuine. Miriam playfully dabbed at Maverick's nose with a paper towel, and the boy's eyes sparkled with joy. Mr. Peterson's hand gripped the window frame. The scene before him painted a picture of everything he'd struggled to provide: warmth, spontaneity, natural affection. Despite his wealth and dedication, he'd never managed to make Maverick laugh quite like that. Just because she's his biological mother doesn't mean she knows what's best for him, he muttered to himself, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip when Mr. Peterson strode into the foyer, his expensive suit jacket draped over one arm. Miriam and Maverick looked up from where they were cleaning up their science materials. I'm meeting with my legal team, he announced, his voice clipped and formal. There will likely be some necessary changes to the household arrangements soon. The implied threat hung heavy in the air. Maverick dropped the beaker he was holding onto the table with a clatter. Please don't make Miriam leave, he burst out, his voice trembling. Please, Mr. Peterson. For a moment, Mr. Peterson's stern facade cracked. He saw the genuine fear in Maverick's eyes, the same fear he'd seen in his own child's eyes years ago when facing loss. His expression softened almost imperceptibly, caught between his burning resentment toward Miriam and his deep care for Maverick's well-being. But the moment passed quickly. Without another word, Mr. Peterson turned and walked out the front door, leaving behind a silence so thick it seemed to echo through the mansion's halls. Miriam stood frozen, one hand protectively on Maverick's shoulder while the boy stared at the closed door with glistening eyes. The sound of Mr. Peterson's car engine starting and fading away only emphasized the heavy quiet that had settled over the house. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, marking each second of the tense silence that followed his departure. The early morning sunlight streamed through the mansion's tall windows as Miriam and Maverick huddled over his science fair project. Their laughter echoed softly through the usually somber living room as they added finishing touches to the display about plant photosynthesis. "Look, the leaves are changing color already," Maverick exclaimed, pointing to the small potted plants they had kept in different light conditions. His eyes sparkled with genuine excitement as he carefully recorded his observations in a notebook. Miriam smiled warmly, helping him measure the growth of each plant. "You've done such wonderful work keeping track of everything," she said, ruffling his hair affectionately. "These charts are going to look amazing on your presentation board." "Do you think I'll win first place?" Maverick asked, his voice hopeful as he arranged colorful graphs on the poster board. "Whether you win or not, I'm already so proud of how hard you've worked," Miriam replied, helping him straighten a slightly crooked photo. Neither noticed Mr. Peterson standing in the doorway, watching their easy interaction with conflicting emotions playing across his face. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as he observed Maverick's natural comfort with Miriam, something he'd never quite achieved despite years of trying. Later that morning, Mr. Peterson sat behind his massive desk as his attorney laid out several legal documents before him. "The custody petition has been filed," the attorney explained, his tone grave. "Ms. Alvarez isn't wasting any time." Mr. Peterson's jaw tightened. "What are our options?" "Limited, if I'm being honest," the attorney admitted. "Once the DNA test confirms what the hospital records suggest, the court will likely favor Miriam's claim. Unless what?" Mr. Peterson leaned forward eagerly. "Unless we can prove she's an unfit mother, or that her absence was abandonment rather than the result of genuine memory loss from trauma. But given the medical records supporting her injury," the attorney's voice trailed off meaningfully. "Find something," Mr. Peterson insisted, his voice sharp with desperation. "There must be something we can use. I can't lose him too." In the afternoon, Miriam sat perched on the edge of her bed in the guest room, her phone pressed to her ear as Ms. Alvarez's voice crackled through the speaker. "The preliminary hearing is set for next week," her attorney explained. "We need to be prepared for Mr. Peterson's team to fight aggressively." Miriam's face drained of color as the reality of the situation hit her. "So soon?" she whispered. "Time is actually on our side here," Ms. Alvarez assured her. "The sooner we establish your rights as Maverick's biological mother, the better." Unknown to Miriam, Maverick stood just outside her door, having come to show her his completed science fair board. His small hands trembled as he clutched the poster, hearing phrases like court date and custody hearing drift through the doorway. His heart raced with mixed emotions. The thrilling possibility that Miriam could officially become his mother warred with his fear of Mr. Peterson's reaction. "Yes, I understand," Miriam was saying into the phone, her voice shaky but determined. "I'll be ready for whatever comes next." Maverick backed away from the door quietly, his science fair project forgotten in his hands. The weight of the coming changes pressed heavily on his young shoulders as he retreated to his room, torn between the two adults who both claimed to want what was best for him. The school auditorium buzzed with excitement as students and parents bustled around, setting up science fair displays on long tables draped in blue cloth. Maverick carefully arranged his plant specimens, while Miriam helped him position his colorful charts and graphs just right. "A little higher on the left," Miriam suggested, adjusting the presentation board. Her gentle guidance and warm smile made Maverick beam with pride. She straightened his collar with natural motherly affection, smoothing away invisible wrinkles from his shoulders. Several teachers and parents noticed their interaction, exchanging knowing glances and whispered conversations. "Look how she is with him," one mother murmured to another. They must be related. You can see it in how they move together. Mr. Peterson stood at the back of the auditorium, his expensive suit making him stand out among the casual crowd. His eyes never left Maverick, but his stance remained rigid and distant. When other parents tried to engage him in conversation, his responses were polite but clipped. As the presentations began, Maverick took his place on stage, his project about photosynthesis drawing interested looks from the judges. Under the warm stage lights, he spoke clearly and confidently, pointing out the different growth patterns in his plants. Miriam sat in the front row, nodding encouragingly at each point he made, her eyes shining with pride. Mr. Peterson watched from his position in the middle section, his expression complex. As Maverick explained his experiments, Mr. Peterson's mind drifted to another science fair years ago, his own child's presentation about butterflies. The memory sent a sharp pain through his chest. When applause erupted for Maverick's presentation, the boys' eyes found Mr. Peterson in the crowd. Despite their recent tension, Maverick offered a small, grateful smile, acknowledging the opportunities Mr. Peterson's wealth had provided, even if their emotional connection remained stunted. After the presentations concluded, families and teachers mingled in the hallway outside the auditorium. Mrs. Thompson, Maverick's science teacher, approached them with a warm smile. "Wonderful presentation, Maverick," she exclaimed. "You clearly put in a lot of work." She turned to Miriam, who stood proudly at Maverick's side. "And you must be Maverick's mother? The resemblance is quite striking." The question hung heavily in the air. Maverick froze, his eyes darting nervously to Mr. Peterson, who had moved within earshot. The businessman's shoulders tensed visibly, his jaw clenching at the teacher's assumption. Miriam's hand trembled slightly on Maverick's shoulder as she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Mr. Peterson took a step closer, his presence commanding attention. Mrs. Thompson sensed the sudden tension, her smile faltering as she glanced between the three of them. Other parents nearby quieted their conversations, aware of the awkward moment unfolding. Maverick shifted his weight from foot to foot, clutching his project materials tighter to his chest. The joy of his successful presentation faded under the weight of the complicated adult situation surrounding him. The fluorescent hallway lights seemed to buzz louder in the strained silence, highlighting the deep divide between the two adults who both claimed a place in his life. The moment crystallized the delicate balance they'd been trying to maintain. Miriam's natural maternal connection, Mr. Peterson's protective instincts, and Maverick caught between them in a public setting where their private struggles suddenly felt exposed. The dining room's chandelier cast a soft glow over the elegant table setting, but nothing could warm the chill that had settled over the evening meal. Mr. Peterson sat rigidly in his chair, his attention fixed firmly on his barely touched plate of roasted chicken and vegetables. The only sounds were the gentle clink of silverware and the occasional shuffle of feet from the household staff. Miriam glanced at Maverick, who was pushing his peas around listlessly. She cleared her throat softly. "You did such an amazing job at the science fair today, Maverick. The judges seemed very impressed with your understanding of photosynthesis." Maverick's face brightened slightly at the praise, but his eyes darted anxiously to Mr. Peterson, waiting for any reaction. The businessman continued to stare at his plate for several long moments before finally speaking. "Yes," Mr. Peterson said curtly, his voice flat. "The presentation was adequate." Without another word, he stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. His plate was still half full as he turned and strode from the dining room, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Later, in Maverick's bedroom, the boy sat cross-legged on his bed while Miriam perched beside him. The science fair ribbon lay forgotten on his desk as he fidgeted with the edge of his blanket. "I don't understand," Maverick said softly. "Mr. Peterson used to at least talk to me during dinner. Now he barely looks at me." His voice cracked slightly with emotion. Miriam placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Oh, sweetheart. Mr. Peterson cares about you very much. That's actually part of the problem. He's scared of losing you. And sometimes fear makes people act in ways that push others away." "But I don't want him to push us away," Maverick insisted, looking up at Miriam with determined eyes. Maybe if we talk to him together? Show him he doesn't have to be afraid? Miriam nodded slowly. That's very wise of you, Maverick. You're right. We should try to help him understand that this isn't about taking you away from him. They found Mr. Peterson in his study, hunched over his massive mahogany desk. Legal papers were spread out before him, illuminated by a single desk lamp. When they knocked and entered, he didn't immediately look up. Mr. Peterson? Maverick's small voice seemed to echo in the book-lined room. Please don't shut us out. Mr. Peterson's hand tightened around his pen, but he finally raised his eyes to meet Maverick's gaze. Miriam stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. I want you to know that I'm not here to steal Maverick away from you, she said. I understand how much you care for him. I just want to be part of his life too. We could find a way to make this work, together. Mr. Peterson's expression flickered, a brief crack appearing in his usual stern facade. For a moment, something vulnerable showed in his eyes, but then he straightened in his chair, his professional mask sliding back into place. You make it sound so simple, he said, shuffling the papers on his desk. But you've been gone for 8 years. Do you have any idea what it takes to raise a child? The responsibility, the commitment? His voice grew harder. And the courts won't just hand him over because you've suddenly remembered who you are. There will be evaluations, home studies, psychological assessments. Are you prepared for all of that? Maverick stood between them, his small shoulders tense as he looked back and forth between the two adults. The study felt smaller somehow, the air thick with unspoken fears and desperate hopes. The morning sun filtered through the Venetian blinds in Ms. Alvarez's downtown law office, casting striped shadows across her polished desk. Miriam sat in a comfortable leather chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she listened to her attorney outline the upcoming custody proceedings. The hearing is scheduled for next Thursday, Ms. Alvarez explained, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. We need to focus on building a strong case that shows you're not only Maverick's biological mother, but also capable of providing him with a stable, nurturing environment. Miriam nodded, her throat tight with anxiety. What exactly do I need to prove? The court will want to see evidence of your improving health, particularly regarding your memory recovery, Ms. Alvarez said, pulling out a legal pad. We should also demonstrate that you have a support network and the means to care for Maverick's emotional and physical needs. The attorney's pen scratched against paper as she made notes. Do you have any medical records from your recent treatments, character references? Even proof of income or housing arrangements would help. Miriam's fingers twisted nervously. I've been staying at Mr. Peterson's mansion since we discovered the connection. Before that, she trailed off, the gaps in her memory still frustrating. At a small diner near the law office, Miriam stirred her untouched coffee while Ms. Alvarez carefully cut into her club sandwich. The lunch crowd's chatter provided a buffer of white noise around their booth. I'm worried about what this is doing to Maverick, Miriam confessed. And even Mr. Peterson, he's clearly struggling with all of this. Ms. Alvarez set down her fork, her expression softening. Have you considered pursuing an amicable agreement with Mr. Peterson? Something that allows both of you to remain in Maverick's life? You mean shared custody? Miriam asked, hope flickering in her eyes. Exactly. Fighting this out in court could be traumatic for everyone involved, especially Maverick. He clearly cares for both of you. Ms. Alvarez dabbed her mouth with a napkin. Sometimes the best legal strategy is finding common ground outside the courtroom. Miriam sat back, considering the possibility. I don't want to tear Maverick apart between us. He deserves better than that. When Miriam returned to the Peterson mansion that afternoon, she found Maverick in the courtyard, pacing between the manicured hedges. His face was pinched with worry, and he jumped slightly when he noticed her approach. Is everything okay? She asked gently. Maverick kicked at a loose stone. I heard Maria and James talking in the kitchen. They said the lawyers are getting ready for a big fight. His voice quavered. I don't want everyone fighting because of me. Miriam's heart ached at his distress. She knelt down to his level, taking his small hands in hers. Nobody is fighting because of you, sweetheart. We're all just trying to figure out the best way to be a family." A thought struck her, and she squeezed his hands encouragingly. "What if we all went out to dinner together tonight? Just a nice, simple meal. You, me, and Mr. Peterson." Maverick's eyes widened with hope. "Really? Do you think Mr. Peterson would come?" "We can ask him," Miriam said, standing up. "Sometimes sharing a meal can help people talk things through better." A tentative smile spread across Maverick's face as he considered the possibility of his two guardians finding peace over dinner. The mansion foyer gleamed in the soft evening light as Miriam smoothed her simple navy dress, a modest choice that still managed to look presentable. Beside her, Maverick bounced on his toes, his small hand wrapped tightly around hers. They both turned at the sound of footsteps echoing down the marble staircase. Mr. Peterson descended, looking uncomfortable in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His tie seemed unnecessarily formal for a casual dinner, but Miriam recognized it as his armor, a way to maintain control in an unfamiliar situation. "Are we really all going?" Maverick asked, his voice tinged with both excitement and uncertainty. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. "Yes, well, I suppose we are." He adjusted his already straight tie. "The car is waiting outside." The drive to the restaurant was quiet, filled only with Maverick's occasional comments about passing buildings. When they arrived at Mason's Family Restaurant, a cozy establishment with warm brick walls and cheerful window boxes, Mr. Peterson looked slightly out of place among the casual diners. The hostess led them to a corner booth, her eyes darting curiously between Mr. Peterson's imposing figure and Miriam's gentle presence. Maverick slid into the middle, creating a bridge between the adults on either side. "They have really good mac and cheese here," Maverick offered, trying to break the ice. "And their chocolate cake is huge." Miriam smiled warmly. "Is that so? Maybe we should share a piece for dessert." "Only after you eat your vegetables," Mr. Peterson added automatically, then looked surprised at his own parental tone. A genuine laugh escaped Maverick, and even Miriam couldn't help but chuckle. Mr. Peterson's lips twitched upward slightly, creating a moment of unexpected lightness. As they ordered their meals, the conversation began to flow more naturally. Maverick told stories about school, and both adults found themselves responding and even building on each other's comments. For a brief moment, they almost felt like a real family sharing a normal dinner. "And then in art class," Maverick was saying, his hands gesturing animatedly, "we made these cool clay sculptures that—" Mr. Peterson's phone buzzed sharply against the table, interrupting the story. His face tightened as he checked the caller ID. "Excuse me," he said stiffly. "I need to take this." He stood quickly, already raising the phone to his ear as he strode toward the restaurant's entrance. Maverick's smile faded. "It's his lawyer, isn't it?" Miriam squeezed his shoulder gently. "Try not to worry. Let's think about what kind of cake we want instead." But when Mr. Peterson returned several minutes later, his expression had darkened considerably. His jaw was set in a hard line as he dropped back into his seat. "The court date," he said tersely. "They're moving it up. My attorney says we need to prepare sooner than expected." Miriam felt her stomach clench, but she fought to keep her voice steady. "How much sooner?" "Next week." Mr. Peterson signaled for the check, dinner forgotten. "We should head back." Maverick's small hand found Miriam's under the table, squeezing it tightly. She could feel him trembling slightly. The drive home was heavy with unspoken words. Streetlights flashed across their faces in rhythmic patterns, highlighting the worry etched on each of their features. Even Maverick remained silent, his earlier enthusiasm completely deflated by the weight of uncertainty hanging over them. Mr. Peterson's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, while Miriam gazed out the window, her reflection in the glass showing the strain of holding back tears. The evening that had held such promise of unity had crumbled under the pressure of their complicated reality. Early morning sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains of Mr. Peterson's study as he hunched over his mahogany desk, surrounded by stacks of legal documents. His fingers trembled slightly as he shuffled through papers detailing custody laws and parental rights. The sudden change in court date had left him feeling cornered, desperate. Almost unconsciously, his hand drifted to the bottom desk drawer, pulling out a worn leather photo album. Inside, protected by clear plastic, was a photograph he rarely allowed himself to look at. A small boy with bright eyes and sandy hair caught mid-laugh on a playground swing. His son Timothy lost to a tragic accident 5 years ago. Mr. Peterson's throat tightened as he traced the edge of the photo. "I couldn't protect you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But I won't fail Maverick. I can't lose another child." He pulled out his phone, dialing his attorney's private number. "We need to discuss additional options," he said firmly. "More aggressive strategies, whatever it takes to ensure Maverick stays here." His voice hardened with resolve. "Yes, even emergency measures if necessary." Later that day, 2 housekeepers whispered in the upstairs corridor, their voices carrying more than they realized. "Mr. Peterson's lawyer mentioned a temporary restraining order," one murmured, "just in case she tries anything before the hearing." "Poor Maverick," the other responded, "caught between them like this." Miriam, approaching with a basket of fresh laundry, froze mid-step. The basket slipped from her grasp, clean clothes tumbling to the floor. The housekeepers scattered quickly, avoiding her eyes. Her hands shook as she gathered the fallen items, tears threatening to spill. A restraining order would separate her from Maverick completely, leaving her powerless to fight for him. How could she possibly compete with Mr. Peterson's resources? His connections? She retreated to her room, setting the basket down with trembling hands. The walls seemed to close in around her as she sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by the weight of her situation. Later that afternoon, Maverick pushed open his bedroom door to find Miriam sitting on the floor, clutching the small knitted fox he'd named Rusty. Silent tears tracked down her cheeks as she stroked the toy's soft orange fur. "Miriam?" His voice was small but steady. "What's wrong?" She quickly wiped her eyes but couldn't hide the tremor in her voice. "Oh, sweetheart, I need to tell you something." She patted the carpet beside her, and Maverick sat down, his shoulder pressing against hers. "Mr. Peterson might do something before the hearing, something that could keep us apart for a while." "Like what?" Maverick's eyes widened with concern. "He might get a special order from the court that says I can't be near you," she explained gently, her voice catching. "I don't want you to be surprised if it happens." Maverick's jaw set in a determined line, looking suddenly older than his 8 years. He wrapped his small arms around Miriam's shoulders, pulling her into a fierce hug. "I'm not letting either of you go," he declared firmly. "We'll figure this out." His voice carried a conviction that made fresh tears spring to Miriam's eyes, but this time they weren't entirely from sadness. She held him close, marveling at his strength, his unwavering spirit in the face of such adult complications. Here she was, meant to be the adult, being comforted by this remarkable child who somehow understood more about love and determination than many grown-ups she knew. "We'll figure this out," Maverick repeated softly, still holding tight to the woman he knew in his heart was his mother. The morning dew still clung to the courtyard grass as Miriam stepped outside, wrapping her cardigan tightly around her shoulders. The weight of yesterday's overheard conversation about restraining orders pressed heavily on her mind. She took deep breaths of the crisp air, trying to steady her nerves. "Miriam?" Maverick's small voice carried across the courtyard. He padded toward her in his pajamas and slippers, his dark curls tousled from sleep. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said softly, opening her arms as he rushed to hug her. "You're up early." "I saw you from my window." Maverick looked up at her with earnest eyes. "I don't want anyone to go away. Can't we all just be a family?" Miriam's heart ached at his simple wish. She knelt down to his level, taking his small hands in hers. "Listen to me, Maverick. No matter what happens, no matter what kind of papers Mr. Peterson might file, or what the lawyers might say, I will never stop fighting for our bond, do you understand?" "Promise?" His voice wavered slightly. "I promise with all my heart," she whispered, pulling him close. In Mr. Peterson's study, morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows as his attorney laid out several documents on the polished desk. "These are the emergency orders we discussed," the lawyer explained, pointing to various marked sections. They'll prevent Ms. Davis from making any decisions about Maverick without your explicit consent." Mr. Peterson's hand hovered over the papers, his pen trembling slightly. "And this is necessary? Given the accelerated court date and her recent behavior, it's the safest course of action." The attorney's voice was firm. "We need to protect your interests, and Maverick's." Mr. Peterson stared at the signature line, remembering Maverick's laughter during their dinner out, the way his eyes lit up when Miriam taught him to knit. Was he protecting Maverick, or was he letting his own fears drive them apart? With a heavy sigh, he signed the papers, but the gnawing sensation in his stomach told him he might be making a terrible mistake. Later that afternoon, a courier arrived at the mansion's entryway. Miriam accepted the thick envelope with shaking hands, her face paling as she read its contents. The legal notice was clear. She was now restricted from making any decisions regarding Maverick without Mr. Peterson's approval. Maverick watched from the stairs, his young face creased with worry. "What is it, Miriam?" She quickly folded the papers, forcing a calm smile. "Just some grown-up paperwork, sweetheart." But her voice quivered slightly, betraying her distress. Once Maverick had gone upstairs, Miriam retreated to her room and pulled out her phone. Her fingers shook as she dialed Ms. Alvarez's number. "They've done it," she said, her voice thick with tears but strengthened by determination. "Mr. Peterson filed emergency orders against me." "We anticipated this might happen," Ms. Alvarez replied steadily. "Are you ready to challenge this?" Miriam wiped her eyes, straightening her shoulders. "I won't let him scare me away again. Not this time. Not from my son." "We'll file our response immediately," Ms. Alvarez assured her. "The judge will need to hear both sides." Ms. Alvarez's office buzzed with quiet determination as she spread several documents across her desk. Miriam sat opposite her, hands clasped tightly in her lap, still processing the emergency orders Mr. Peterson had filed against her. "I know yesterday's notice was devastating," Ms. Alvarez began, her voice steady and reassuring. "But we've received something that might change everything." She pulled out a stack of sworn affidavits, sliding them toward Miriam. Miriam's hands trembled as she picked up the first document. "These are from people who knew you before the accident," Ms. Alvarez confirmed. "Former colleagues, neighbors, even your prenatal care nurse. They all remember you, Miriam. They remember how excited you were about becoming a mother, how you prepared everything months in advance." Tears welled in Miriam's eyes as she read through the statements. Her former neighbor described how Miriam had converted her spare room into a nursery, painting it herself. Her colleague recalled how she'd spend lunch breaks knitting tiny booties and sweaters. "This one," Ms. Alvarez said, pointing to a particular affidavit, "is from Sarah Chen, your prenatal nurse. She specifically remembers the distinctive birthmark during your ultrasound appointments. She's willing to testify about your dedication to proper prenatal care and your obvious joy about motherhood." Later that day, in the Peterson mansion's sprawling garden, Maverick tugged gently at Miriam's hand. "I want to show you something," he whispered, leading her past manicured hedges and ornate fountains. They walked until they reached a secluded corner hidden behind a cluster of old oak trees. "This is my special place," Maverick explained, showing her a small clearing with a worn wooden bench. "Nobody else knows about it, not even Mr. Peterson." Miriam sat beside him on the bench, taking in the peaceful sanctuary. Sunlight filtered through the leaves above them, creating dancing patterns on the ground. "Are you scared?" Maverick asked suddenly, his voice small but direct. Miriam considered the question carefully. "Yes," she admitted, "but being scared doesn't mean we give up. Sometimes the things worth fighting for are the scariest." "I'm scared too," Maverick confessed, "but when you sing that lullaby, I feel better." Miriam smiled softly and began to hum the familiar tune. To her surprise, Maverick joined in, his young voice matching the melody perfectly. They sat together, their shared song filling the secret garden space with warmth and hope. Their peaceful moment was shattered when they returned to the mansion's foyer. Mr. Peterson stood at the bottom of the grand staircase, his expression darkening as he watched them enter together. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice tight with barely contained emotion. "We were just in the garden," Maverick explained quickly. "Please, Mr. Peterson, don't be angry. Don't make Miriam go away." Mr. Peterson's jaw clenched as Maverick moved closer to Miriam. The boy looked between the two adults, his eyes pleading. "I love you both," he said earnestly. "Why can't we all be together? Like a real family?" The words seemed to hit Mr. Peterson like a physical blow. His face flickered with pain, old wounds clearly surfacing. He straightened his tie, a gesture that seemed more defensive than practical. "We'll let the courts decide," he said flatly, though his voice carried a slight tremor. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Miriam and Maverick standing in the foyer, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on them both. The courthouse lobby echoed with hushed voices and clicking heels, as Miriam, Ms. Alvarez, and Maverick made their way through the security checkpoint. Maverick's small fingers clutched the handmade plush animal tightly against his chest, his other hand gripping Miriam's sleeve. "It'll be okay," Miriam whispered, though her own voice wavered slightly. Ms. Alvarez walked beside them, her briefcase filled with affidavits and hospital records that could change everything. The lobby's marble floors reflected the morning light when Mr. Peterson appeared with his attorney. His usual commanding presence seemed diminished, his shoulders tight with tension as he kept his eyes fixed on the polished floor. The physical distance between the two parties felt like a canyon, filled with unspoken words and fears. Maverick's grip on the plush animal tightened when he saw Mr. Peterson, but the man wouldn't meet his gaze. The silence grew heavier with each passing moment until a court officer called their case number. Inside the courtroom, the judge's presence commanded immediate attention. She carefully reviewed the stack of documents before her, occasionally glancing over her reading glasses at both parties. The wooden benches creaked as people shifted nervously. Mr. Peterson's attorney rose first, his voice confident and measured. "Your Honor, Mr. Peterson has provided Maverick with every advantage: the finest education, a stable home, and financial security that ensures his future. Meanwhile, Ms. Davis's condition raises serious concerns. Her memory loss makes her ability to care for a child questionable at best." Ms. Alvarez stood next, her posture straight and determined. "Your Honor, my client's separation from her son was not by choice. The accident that caused her memory loss was precisely what tore this family apart. We have testimony from multiple sources about Ms. Davis's character before the accident, her preparation for motherhood, her dedication to her unborn child's well-being." She lifted an affidavit. "Sarah Chen, the prenatal nurse who cared for Ms. Davis, can confirm the distinctive birthmark that matches Maverick's. But more importantly, Your Honor, this case isn't just about practical provisions. It's about a child's right to know and be loved by his mother, a mother who, despite everything she's been through, has never stopped loving him." During the midday recess, the hallway outside the courtroom buzzed with quiet conversations. Mr. Peterson stood near a window, his reflection showing the strain of the morning's proceedings. Maverick approached him, still holding the plush animal close. "Why are you doing this?" Maverick's voice was small but steady. "Why do you want to keep Miriam away?" Mr. Peterson's composed facade cracked slightly. He turned to face Maverick, his eyes showing a pain he usually kept hidden. "I had a son once," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "He was just a little younger than you. One day he was there and the next—" He swallowed hard. "Sometimes the world takes away the people we love, Maverick. I can't let that happen again." Tears welled in Maverick's eyes. "But you're trying to take Miriam away from me," he said. "And that hurts too." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I don't want to lose any of you. There has to be a way to be a family." Mr. Peterson stood frozen, his usual certainty visibly shaken by Maverick's words. His hands trembled slightly as he straightened his tie, but his expression remained resolute, even as the weight of Maverick's plea hung heavy in the air between them. The afternoon session began with a hush falling over the courtroom as Sarah Thompson, a former nurse from Metro General Hospital, took the stand. Her gray hair was neatly pulled back, and her experienced eyes held both compassion and certainty as she spoke. "I worked the rehabilitation ward when Miriam Davis was brought in," Sarah testified, her voice clear and steady. Even in her confused state, she would constantly ask about a baby. She'd wake up in the middle of the night searching the halls, convinced she needed to find her son. Mr. Peterson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers drumming silently against the wooden barrier before him. "Did Ms. Davis ever stop searching?" Ms. Alvarez asked. "No," Sarah replied firmly. Even after her release, she would return to the hospital, hoping to find answers. She'd show up with drawings of the birthmark she remembered, asking if anyone had seen a baby with that mark. Her determination never wavered, even when her memories were scattered. Mr. Peterson's face tightened as he listened. His attorney leaned over to whisper something, but he seemed lost in thought, his eyes fixed on the nurse's weathered face as she described Miriam's relentless quest. The judge, after hearing several more witnesses, removed her glasses and addressed the courtroom. "I'll need time to review all the evidence presented today. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning at 9. Her gavel struck with finality, dismissing everyone until the next day. In the courthouse parking lot, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the asphalt. Ms. Alvarez stood close to Miriam, speaking in encouraging tones. The nurse's testimony was compelling. "Stay hopeful, Miriam. The judge sees how much you fought to find him." Maverick, his small frame somehow filling the space between Miriam and Mr. Peterson, looked between them with pleading eyes. "Please," he said softly. "Can't we work this out together? I don't want anyone to be sad anymore." Mr. Peterson's stern facade cracked slightly as he turned toward Miriam. His voice, usually so commanding, came out barely above a whisper. "I see how much you love him. I just can't lose him too." His words carried the weight of old grief. Miriam's eyes filled with tears as understanding dawned. "You've lost someone too," she said gently. "I know that fear." The tension hung heavy until Maverick suggested they visit the small cafe across the street. Inside, they found a quiet corner booth, away from curious eyes. The ceramic cups clinked softly as the waitress set down 3 hot chocolates. Maverick's suggestion. "My science presentation is next month," Maverick said suddenly, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "It's about how plants grow toward light. I've been working really hard on it." He looked between Miriam and Mr. Peterson hopefully. Maybe you both could come?" Mr. Peterson's shoulders relaxed slightly as he watched Maverick demonstrate his planned presentation with animated hand gestures. The businessman's usual rigid posture softened, and he glanced at Miriam over his untouched drink. "Perhaps," he said slowly, measuring each word, "we should discuss options before tomorrow's ruling, for Maverick's sake." His voice carried a note of concession that hadn't been there before. Miriam nodded, careful hope blooming in her chest as she watched Mr. Peterson's stern expression gradually ease. The afternoon light filtered through the cafe windows, warming the space between them as they sat together, no longer as adversaries but as 3 people trying to find their way forward. The courthouse hallway buzzed with nervous energy as people filtered in for the final hearing. Morning light streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Mr. Peterson, looking more disheveled than usual in his expensive suit, caught Miriam's eye and gestured toward a quiet alcove. "Could we speak privately?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual authority. Miriam nodded, following him to the secluded spot. She noticed his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie. "I need to tell you something," Mr. Peterson began, his words careful and measured. Part of me knew all along that Maverick needed what you could give him, a mother's love, something I couldn't provide no matter how hard I tried." He paused, swallowing hard. "But I was terrified that once you came back into his life, there wouldn't be room for me anymore." Miriam's eyes softened as she watched this powerful man reveal his vulnerability. "We all have room in our hearts to love," she said gently. "No one can replace what you've done for him. You've given him security, education, opportunities, but more than that, you've given him your heart." Inside the courtroom, tension filled the air as both legal teams took their places. Maverick sat between Ms. Alvarez and Miriam, clutching his knitted plush animal. The judge settled into her chair, preparing to hear final arguments. Mr. Peterson's attorney stood, straightening his papers. Your Honor, before we proceed with final arguments, my client wishes to propose an alternative arrangement. A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. Mr. Peterson acknowledges Ms. Davis as Maverick's biological mother and proposes a shared custody arrangement, ensuring both parties maintain significant roles in the child's life. The courtroom erupted in hushed chatter. Miriam turned to Mr. Peterson, her eyes brimming with grateful tears. He met her gaze with a slight nod, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. In the judge's chambers, natural light filtered through Venetian blinds as the three adults and Maverick gathered around the large desk. The judge's expression was warm as she reviewed the proposed arrangement. "I want to commend both parties for finding a path forward that puts Maverick's needs first," she said, her tone maternal yet professional. "It's clear to this court that love and stability from both figures will best serve this child's interests." She picked up her pen, signing the documents with flourish. Ms. Davis will have full legal guardianship rights, while Mr. Peterson's role as a paternal guardian figure is legally recognized. She set down her pen and smiled at Maverick, who stood between Miriam and Mr. Peterson. "Young man, I wish you the brightest of futures with your family, both of them." Maverick beamed, his small hand finding Miriam's while he leaned against Mr. Peterson's side. The morning sun streamed through the window, warming the room as the judge handed over the signed papers, making official what their hearts had already known. They were a family, unconventional perhaps, but bound by something stronger than tradition: love. The school auditorium buzzed with excitement as parents and teachers filled the rows of seats. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting a warm glow across the stage where students stood in neat lines. Maverick, dressed in his best clothes, shifted from foot to foot as the principal approached the microphone. In the front row, Miriam sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes already glistening with pride. Beside her, Mr. Peterson maintained his usual composed demeanor, though the slight tremor in his hands betrayed his emotional investment in the moment. "And now," the principal announced, her voice carrying through the space, "the award for resilience and creativity goes to a student who has shown extraordinary determination and imagination in his class projects. Please join me in congratulating Maverick." The auditorium erupted in applause. Maverick's face broke into a radiant smile as he stepped forward to accept the certificate and medal. Miriam dabbed at her eyes with a tissue while Mr. Peterson's measured clapping grew more enthusiastic with each step his foster son took. Several days later, the Peterson mansion dining room glowed with warmth from carefully placed candles. The long table, usually formal and imposing, now felt intimate and welcoming, with its careful arrangement of dishes. Steam rose from serving bowls filled with comfort foods, many of them Miriam's recipes that she'd taught the kitchen staff. Maverick couldn't stop grinning as he passed the breadbasket to Mr. Peterson, who had loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, a rare sight that spoke volumes about his relaxed state. "I've been thinking," Mr. Peterson said, setting down his water glass. "This feels right. All of us, together like this. What if we made it a tradition? Every Sunday evening we gather for dinner as a family." His voice softened on the word family, and he glanced at Miriam, seeking her approval. "That sounds perfect," Miriam responded warmly, reaching over to squeeze Maverick's hand. "A toast," Mr. Peterson declared, raising his glass, "to new beginnings, and to the family we've become." The crystal glasses clinked together, accompanied by genuine laughter, a sound that seemed to chase away the last shadows of their previous conflicts. As the evening drew to a close, they stepped out onto the mansion's front lawn. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and pink, its dying rays catching the windows of distant skyscrapers. A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers from the garden. Maverick, standing between his two guardians, began to hum the familiar lullaby, the one that had helped bridge the gap between past and present. Miriam's soft voice joined in, her melody weaving through Maverick's humming like silk. Mr. Peterson closed his eyes, his face relaxed and peaceful, as he listened to the tune that had once sparked such jealousy, but now represented their unity. Without words, they drew together in a group hug, Miriam's maternal warmth, Mr. Peterson's protective strength, and Maverick's boundless love creating a circle of belonging. Their silhouettes merged against the painted sky, three separate lives woven into one family tapestry. The setting sun cast long shadows across the lawn as they held each other, their embrace speaking volumes about how far they'd come. The familiar melody of the lullaby drifted on the evening air, a gentle reminder of the bonds that had brought them together and the love that would keep them that way. If you enjoyed the story of Maverick, Miriam, and Mr. Peterson, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.